We have been talking, and last time I talked about the characteristics of what makes a musical musical and why it is a musical and how it's different than from other forms of theater. We're going to spend some time now looking at this development of the American musical. And exactly that's the reason why we're going to do this, and that is it is the American musical. This is our contribution to the world of theater. We are the ones, exactly how it is invented is a little bit, we can go into that and get lost in various speculation, but we certainly know that we are the ones who brought together the form, we are the ones who developed this, we are the ones who used it then, and it has become the major staple in the American theater. Throughout the 19th century, various kinds of musical reviews, and we talked about musical reviews last time, musical reviews were extremely popular. One particular form that a musical review took was called a minstrel show. Now, a minstrel show was a form of entertainment in which began somewhere late 1830s, 1840s, and it was white entertainers who blacked their faces and then presented material in which they sort of mimicked especially the African American slaves that they had seen on the plantations in the South. And using that as a kind of basis, then they developed a whole series of skits, in some cases songs, music, rhythms, which they had seen there. And it developed into a form with the white entertainer blacking his face, and it's called the minstrel show. We eventually find that this develops into forms in which various entertainers write music specifically for the minstrel show. And that is, one of the most famous of it is the American composer Stephen Foster. And most of the Foster songs that we know today, such as Oh Susanna, Oh Folks at Home, Beautiful Dreamer, Captown Races, Swanee River, all of those written by Foster were originally written by him to be sung in the minstrel shows. He was a member of one of the famous minstrel groups of the time and specifically wrote material for his group and for other groups to sing. And even after the Civil War, the minstrel show continued to be popular, and eventually many of the black entertainers found that this became an entry that they could have into show business themselves. And that is, they became then members of minstrel shows. And what we find, it's perhaps one of those moments in which we certainly cannot be proud, and one of those moments of degradation that but one must also realize, and that is that sometimes if the black entertainers were not black enough, then they found it necessary that they had to black their faces in order to be a part of the minstrel show. This was a part of the specific, very definite makeup, and that is that a minstrel show always consisted of the black face, the white, use of the white lips or the red lips, white or red lips, and this very definite makeup then was a part of the minstrel show. And even the black entertainers, when they became part of the minstrel show, continued this. The minstrel shows actually, while sort of faded out somewhere in the earlier part of the century, actually continued, however, right on down to the 1940s in terms of groups touring it. They were especially popular in the South, and I grew up in Tennessee. And I can remember when I was a boy in the 1940s that every 2 or 3 summers I lived on the banks of the Cumberland River, and the Cumberland River flows into the Mississippi. And so what would happen would be that there would be a boat which would come up from New Orleans, coming up the Mississippi River, then turn into the Cumberland, come around the Cumberland, and at each of those places it came up the Mississippi and then in the Cumberland, it would stop at rather large towns, and at that point then present the minstrel show. The one I remember was called Silas Green from New Orleans, and it was, the boat would come up, would dock. There would then be a parade with the minstrel entertainers moving from the dock on the riverside, and they would move across town to the African American section of town, and specifically where there was a park in that side of town, and in a vacant lot beside the park, they would then pitch their tent, and they would then present a minstrel show. Now, I should say these were all African American entertainers, and they would then present, however, their version of this traditional minstrel show, which at this point, from having begun in the 1830s and 40s, it's now 100 years later, and it's certainly still being played. I mentioned the minstrel show specifically because, among other things, this is one of the ways, especially in which what we find is the music and, most of all, the rhythms of the African rhythms come into and are brought into and become a part of the musical sound that becomes American music. Also, we find during the 19th century that there develops what is called vaudeville and burlesque. Now, in earlier times, burlesque was respectable. It is only later on, in fact, probably not until the latter part of the 19th century and the earlier part of the 20th century, that it becomes unrespectable and becomes what we know of with its emphasis on sex and sexual innuendos and perhaps even actual strips of some kind or the other. But at an earlier point in time, burlesque was a popular form of entertainment and did not have the stress on the sexual that it developed later. Now, both vaudeville and burlesque were full of songs and skits, and usually and frequently might have some kind of production numbers. The music, which was included in vaudeville, would be the popular music of the day, or it would have songs that would be specifically written for it. And so thus, drawing upon the many ethnic sounds that we find here that are coming into mainstream America, using the ethnic sounds and the heritage from which these various ethnic groups came, and that is not only those from Africa, but also the Irish and the English and the Scottish and the Germans. And each of those brings with them a particular kind of music or sound which is a part of their heritage, and this all begins to mix and develop into what we think of as American popular music, and particularly the sound of what becomes the sound of American music. Now, most people begin dating the American musical from 1865. Now, we really know that this is just sort of a convenient date, and the title, The Black Crook, is a rather convenient title to latch on to because all of this was pure accident. And that is that in New York City, at a theater establishment, there was a proprietor who was getting ready to present a melodrama of the period called The Black Crook. And this was a production which which had some music within it. And he, however, was beginning to have doubts about whether this particular production was going to be very profitable as far as he was concerned. It didn't look to fare so well. And so then through an accident, a proprietor of one of the other theaters came to him and said, you know, my theater has burned down and I have already booked a group from Paris, France, a ballet group, and I no longer have a theater to put them in. Do you think that somehow or the other that you could find some way to use this ballet group? And at which point this proprietor felt that maybe he'd had a stroke of luck, because this seemed to be a far better seller than perhaps the production that he had scheduled, the Black Crook. But neither could he cancel the Black Crook, one, because he'd already hired the actors, he had the scenery all built, they had the costumes, and now at this point, he's going to present it, so he gets the brilliant idea, I'm going to combine these two. So, lo and behold, he then has the Black Crook played, and at certain points, as we arrive at moments between the scenes, the ballet group come on and they perform. Well, by the time we get through, this thing has lasted 5 hours, from 7 o'clock in the evening until just after midnight. It turns out to be a hit. It is a surprise of everybody. Now, what one must realize, among other things, is one of the reasons here is that one of the reasons why it was possibly a hit is not just the material, but the ballet troupe. This is, remember, 1865. We are now in the middle of the Victorian period, and yes, the United States was in many ways as Victorian as England was. We perhaps had a somewhat different way of looking at it, but we certainly, in terms of clothing, women during this period of time wore clothes in which almost no part of the body was revealed. The collars came high, and so then we came to here, and we have the face. The sleeves come long, and they come down to here, and we have only the hands that can be seen. And of course, when we get down, the skirts go all the way to the ground, and then we have the stockings, and we have the shoes, and so we see nothing down there. We have this ballet troupe, however, which are wearing what in ballet terms we call tutu skirts. And that is these skirts that are around the waist and are rather short. Now, there's no bare flesh involved here because, indeed, the ballet dancers did indeed wear what is comparable to what we call tights. But the limbs were revealed. That is, you could see real, honest-to-goodness legs down there. You could see real, and these tutu skirts and tutus were also in such a way that the arms were revealed. Well, this immediately began to bring to the stage something that was could not be seen otherwise, and it became very popular. Also, the other thing was the production of the Black Crook was thoroughly denounced from the pulpit. There is nothing better for theater to sell tickets than to get itself denounced by a religious group and to be denounced from the pulpit, and at which point it becomes an instant bestseller. And this is exactly what happened to the Black Crook. Well, the Black Crook not only was successful at that point, it then, remember, this is long before the days of film or television or any other mass kind of communication. At this point, then, the owners of the Black Crook began to put together several different companies, and they fanned out from New York and began to go across the country. They would go east, they would go west to Pennsylvania, and then on into the Midwest, and eventually into California. They would go north and go to Boston and to other places. They would go south to Philadelphia and on down the various urban cities along the eastern seaboard, presenting performance after performance of the Black Crook. In fact, the Black Crook continued in one production or another well into almost the end of the 19th century. So for more than 30 years, we find some productions, the Black Crook playing somewhere in this country for a long time, and he kept coming back and playing in New York City, and then it would go out again, and he would tour the country. Well, theater people are just like anybody else, and just like contemporary television. What happens in modern day television when one television show catches on to popularity? Then next thing you know, the other networks begin to copy it, and we have their version of whatever is the popular show of the day, and we have then 3, 4, 5, 6 clones of the original production, which is now very popular. Well, this is exactly, of course, what happens in the theater. The popularity of the Black Crook is recognized, and this combination then of play, dialogue, characters, story, of music, and of, in this case, the ballet. And even though it didn't fit together at all, it didn't matter. What did matter was that this then became a form that in which other people began then to mix story and songs, characters, and bring in popular dance of the day, and began to develop musicals of one kind or the other. And when we find between 1865 and for the next 30 to 40 years, there are a number of productions that develop using this combination, telling a story, having characters, combining it with music, song, and dance. We find all of this really begins to come together best right after the turn of the century in an entertainer, composer, writer by the name of George M. Cohan. Now, George M. Cohan had come from a family who were vaudeville entertainers. In fact, George grew up in vaudeville and became very early on a member of the Cohan family of vaudeville entertainers, and they went from one vaudeville theater to another theater and toured, and thus grew up as a touring vaudeville entertainer. George, however, had other ideas about what he wanted to do, and so finally all this came together for him in 1905 when he wrote a musical called Little Johnny Jones. Now, I say wrote a musical. I should point out that what George M. Cohan did is he wrote the book, he wrote the lyrics, he wrote the music, he directed it, and he starred in it along with the other members of his family, his mother, his father, and his sister Josie. So we find George M. Cohan here now doing it all, and that is writing a book, writing a story, writing the music, writing the lyrics, directing it, starring it, and bringing his family in. It was an enormous success. We also find here that Cohan begins to write then for the next 10 years or so a whole series of musicals which follow pretty much along the same lines of what he had done in Little Johnny Jones. And that is writing now musicals about somewhat fairly ordinary people, people we recognize, people who are ordinary Americans. He was writing about himself, yes, in many cases. In fact, Cohan loved to glorify himself, but he loved also to glorify America, glorify its people, its spirit, its beliefs. And every musical that he wrote, in some way or the other, celebrated this country. His family had come from Ireland. He had been born, however, an American, and he was proud of being that. And we find then Cohan writing a whole series of songs, all of which in some way or the other celebrate this country and its beliefs. You're a grand old flag. Give my regards to Broadway. 45 minutes from Broadway. and what became his sort of his own particular song in which he wrote, called Yankee Doodle Dandy. This indeed brings together all of these things that we've been talking about, because Cohan now takes his heritage from which he has come, takes the vaudeville from which he grew up in, and knowing what works in vaudeville, he now writes a very specific form, and that is a story with songs, with music, and most of all, what he does is he celebrates this country. And this is what specifically then makes it American musical comedy. And what we're going to find is that basically from this point, and that is from the earlier part of the 20th century down through at least until we arrive at the 1960s, this is what the musical does over and over again. And that is, it celebrates America. It celebrates and it uses our sound. It uses the popular music of the day. And what we begin to find is then that the musical begins then to, the music of the musical begins to move back and forth. And that is, that which is popular music of the day is the sound of the American musical. The composers who write the musicals of the period are also the same composers who are writing that popular music of the day, and they then incorporate that sound into the into the musical. So that this trade-off, this moving back and forth, becomes a very specific source of energy for the American musical, and that is the composers who write popular music also write the musicals of the day. They feed off each other, they stimulate each other. And the sounds of American music, and that is those sounds which bring together those various sounds from ethnic heritage, the rhythms, and especially the rhythms that we take over and use from the Africans, and we bring these together and we create then a music which is recognizably ours, that which is an American musical, an American sound, and it's that music that is a part of the musical. So following in the example of George M. Cohan, we find then very shortly a whole number of American composers and writers now began writing. Jerome Kern, Irving Berlin, the brothers, George and Ira Gershwin, George writing the music, Ira writing the lyrics, Cole Porter. All of them began developing very specifically the musical, or musical comedy. And that is, the emphasis is on comedy. It is lighthearted, it is full of merriment. In fact, frequently the stories were closed lines, that is, they were simply very slender lines that went along on which then composers could hang song after song after song here. We also find that this is the point at which many of the African American writers and entertainers find their entry into the legitimate and professional theater. We've talked earlier about the minstrel show, but now we find that they begin to develop and write full-fledged musicals which bring in very specifically those sounds and those rhythms that they had developed, and also those dances. And very specific, out of the 1920 musicals, which were written by African Americans of the period, come some of the major popular dances of the period, the Black Bottom, the Charleston. Those very specifically originated in musicals that were written by the African Americans, were presented in New York Broadway stage, toured the country, And as we saw, those dances, they were picked up out of the musicals and developed into popular dance of the period. Most frequently also, musicals revolve around boy-girl stories in some way or the other. Boy sees girl, girl sees boy, boy falls in love, girl falls in love. They get together, they part, whatever. But again, a story which is here to allow then the composer and lyric writer to write one marvelous song, one after the other. Many of the musicals of George Gershwin as composer with his brother Ira turn up and give us song after song which have entered into the pantheon and become a part of American popular music, as well as is true of Irving Berlin and Cole Porter. We come to 1927, and we come to the landmark musical Showboat. This is one of those major productions which to some extent point where musical comedy might go. We find here we have book and lyrics by Oscar Hammerstein II. In this particular case, we find Hammerstein using a novel, what was an extremely popular novel of the day by Edna Ferber called Showboat. He adapts the novel into a musical, writing the actual book himself, writing the dialogue scenes, following the storyline is laid out by Ferber, and he writes the lyrics for all of the songs. The music is by Jerome Kern. Now, Jerome Kern brings with him to this particular music a classical training which he had received in his earlier life in Germany. But Kern, upon his coming to America, is much more interested in writing popular music and not classical music. But Kern brings with him then a very erudite sense of what is song, a very knowledgeable, educated sense about what song is. And in the earlier musicals, which Kern had written prior to Showboat, he had particularly shown how then sophisticated and educated knowledge of music could be incorporated into the musical forms and songs that Kern wrote. It is then, particularly then in Showboat, that Kern now is allowed and develops this to its fullest. In many ways, Showboat is the first serious musical, although it still went under the nomenclature of musical comedy. It is a serious musical comedy, if that's not a contradiction somewhere along the way. Also, the other thing about Showboat is it is a panorama, as the novel that Edna Ferber wrote. It is a panorama of American life from 1880s to the 1920s. It begins on the levee of the Mississippi River with the showboat that went up and down the Mississippi and would stop and play at towns, just as I indicated at an earlier time, in the earlier point this hour, and I talked about Silas Green from New Orleans. This showboat would pull up to the levee, but instead of getting off the showboat and then pitching a tent and playing, in this particular case, the showboat was the theater itself. And so this is a musical about a showboat wherein musicals are presented on stage. However, this is also a story going and set in the South 1880s, so therefore it also deals greatly with the racial relations of the period. It shows us then the difference between the white entertainers and the Africans who have a life along the Mississippi. It also concerns and has what is called the great miscegenation scene. Miscegenation is the unlawful marriage between races. And this was in most southern states, in fact, in many states in this country, it was against the law well into the 1950s, even into the 1960s, for two people from two different races to marry each other. This was a miscegenation. And there's the great miscegenation scene in which there is an entertainer on, a white entertainer on the Showboat who actually is black. She has one drop of African blood in her, and so therefore under the laws of the South, she was black, even though she is white and even though she has passed for white. And there comes in the moment when the sheriff who has heard of this comes in, and at this point then Julie, who is married to one of the other entertainers, then at that point the owner of the Showboat denies that Julie is black and that she is, and says that she is a white entertainer. But the sheriff says, I don't have evidence, but what I will tell you is if she is black, you have an unlawful mixing here of black entertainers before a white audience, and this is against the law. And so what we find then at the end of the scene is Julie and her husband leave the Showboat. There are also many comic scenes here within the Showboat, and so that it still continues in the vein of the musicals that have come earlier than this. There is also the romantic relationship that go on between Magnolia, who is the daughter of the owner of the Showboat, and the man she falls in love with, Gaylord Ravenel. And we follow then their romance and their marriage and their eventual leaving of the Showboat and going to Chicago in the teens. And so we have the romance and the marriage, and eventually the fact that Gaylord is a gambler, and he leaves then Magnolia and their infant daughter when he feels he can no longer support them. So we have characters with much greater depth. We have story with a great deal more complexity than we have had before. We have also, of course, all of this, and that is these stories and these characters are given the glorious music of Jerome Kern. And indeed, many of the songs there became a part of the popular pantheon of the day and still continue down to the present day. From Showboat come such songs as Make Believe, Can't Help Loving That Man, and of course that which is probably the most famous of all songs from Showboat, Oh Man River. What happens following Showboat is that Showboat remains to some extent somewhat an isolated example. And that is, while it was enormously popular and it was superbly produced by one of the great showmen of the New York theater, Florence Ziegfeld, and it had a quite respectable run, hit run in New York. There were productions, touring productions that went out, and it was quite popular across the country. But we find at this point that there are not many other people who are willing to follow and develop the serious form of musical comedy. The next step, perhaps landmark we want to look at, is 1931. The musical is Of Thee I Sing, and in this particular case, music by George Gershwin, lyrics by Ira Gershwin, and the book by two comic writers, George S. Kaufman and Maury Riskin. Now, Of Thee I Sing turns out to be what? It is a satire, and it is a satire on what? On our presidential elections. It has as its leading character a presidential candidate who perhaps is not the swiftest of characters, but who is certainly good looking and whose platform is, what could anyone argue with? His platform is love. And so thus we find one of the leading songs in the show is Love is Sweeping the Country, which becomes then one of our, certainly a well-known song from the pen of George and Ira Gershwin. One of the other songs from the song indicates the bandwagon that we are going to be on here, which again has become a well-known song, Wintergreen for President. And then, of course, the title song itself, Of Thee I Sing. What, however, makes this makes this a landmark musical is not only that it is a satire on that which is very much our institution, and that is our presidential elections, but this becomes then the first musical to win the Pulitzer Prize for the best drama of the year. So therefore, Of Thee I Sing is given the Pulitzer Prize as the best drama for the year. This is the first time that a musical has been given this kind of an award. But to show the uncertainty of what this was all about, the committee gave the Pulitzer Prize to Kaufman, Riskin, and Ira Gershwin. They couldn't decide what to do with the music. So therefore, they didn't give a Pulitzer Prize to George Gershwin. They gave it to those who wrote the words. Well, that's the only time that's happened, and there have been a number of musicals which since 1931 have won Pulitzer Prizes, and in all the cases after that, the composer was certainly included within the group. But what this does is it does legitimize the musical. It makes it legitimate. It gives it then what is one of the prestigious awards in the theater, and one of the prestigious awards. There's a Pulitzer Prize for literature, the Pulitzer Prize for drama, various other kinds of prestigious awards. This now puts the musical into that category and gives it then a legitimate status that it did not have before. The Gershwins go on in 1935 to write another landmark, Porgy and Bess, taken from a novel by DuBose Hayward. And DuBose Hayward also works with Ira Gershwin on turning this into, and what is it? Well, this is one of those things. It's one of those works. George Gershwin said he was writing an opera, and he called it a folk opera, and maybe that's what it is. But it also is very much the American music. It is very much the American sound, and yes, it is written like an opera. That is, it is through composed. So therefore, it has all of the things that one thinks of as in an opera, and it does have recitatives. And if you remember, I said a recitative is the sort of sung, sung dialogue that we have here. So it does have recitatives, but it was produced in a Broadway musical house to start with. And it does have, whatever they are, songs that became a part of American popular song, and that is, just to name a few, Summertime, I Loves You, Porgy, which has become one of the standard favorite for many jazz singer. A Woman is a Sometime Thing. Bess, You Is My Woman. It Ain't Necessarily So. All of those certainly sound like American popular songs and have become a part of American popular songs. So what this is, I don't know that it matters, but it is certainly a part of and comes from the team which create part of American musical theater. Unfortunately, George Gershwin was to die from brain tumor within 2 years of finishing Porgy and Bess, and he did not follow on. What would have come from his pen if he had allowed to go on and develop? We might have seen many more works which might well have changed the course of where American musical theater was going. We also find from the 1920s and 30s the team of Richard Rodgers and Lawrence Hart. They come together first in the mid-1920s, and they began writing musicals, which are pretty much like the other musicals, that is, in terms of the form of that particular day, but they are full of the songs, the wonderful, witty lyrics of Lawrence Hart and the marvelous music of Richard Rodgers. Starting within 10 years, in the mid-1930s, they began to do some experimenting with the form of what the musical is. And we find in 1936, in the musical called On Your Toes, that they introduced a ballet as part of the last act. And the ballet was called Slaughter on 10th Avenue. Now, in this particular case, what they do is a part of the musical itself is a ballet troupe, and the ballet troupe performs this particular ballet. It's not totally integrated into the story, and I'm making this particular difference because we're going to see that it makes a difference when we get to Oklahoma within a few years. But they do then introduce serious dance, or one might say artistic dance. Dance, of course, has always been a part, but this has been, as we have seen, dance much more in a popular form, and as we indicated in the 1920s, frequently the dances that were in the musicals, as the Charleston, for example, then became a popular dance and a part of the dance craze of the American public of the 1920s. But here in 1936, we introduce then artistic dance, ballet, as a part of the musical On Your Toes. And then in 1940, they write a musical called Pal Joey. Now, Pal Joey may be one of the great step forward in many ways, and that is, it is a music which is very strongly book-centered. It is also full of very specific characters, and that is the characters who are delineated in great detail. And we understand those characters very, very well as very specific individuals. But where this differs in many ways from other musicals is it introduces plain old sex. And in this particular case, sex as lust. Now, we've already talked of one of the major components of every musical is, of course, always the romantic entanglement, which of course is based frequently on the sexual, which is usually based on the sexual attraction of any boy and girl. But here in this particular case, this isn't a boy-girl relationship that we're talking about. In this case, what we find is in Pal Joey, we introduce an older, rich woman who finds herself attracted to a younger man, toys with him, and then when it finally arrives at the moment when it is no longer attractive or useful to her, she throws him out, and he is no longer wanted. And the song which she sings in the musical, called Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, in fact, at the point that it was introduced in 1940, the lyrics were so suggestive that this particular song for years was banned from radio and could never be played in the unbowdlerized lyrics that this particular song has. We also have another song in the show called Zip. And this particular song is being sung by a stripper. And the stripper, what the song is all about is the stripper is saying, as she takes off her clothes, as she zip, and another piece of clothing comes off, this is what she is thinking about as she is singing this particular song. Now, it is not what you think, perhaps, because in this song and in her lyrics, she refers to Noel Coward, Stravinsky, Schopenhauer, and Rip Van Winkle. All of this is what she is thinking as she goes through her strip routine. It's a very funny song here. Pal Joey was not a hit. Pal Joey, in fact, was denounced thoroughly. And the leading reviewer of the day, Brooks Atkinson, who wrote for the New York Times, wrote that one could not draw good water from a foul well. And he was thoroughly disliked the musical, and indeed was denouncing it within his review. Most other reviewers felt somewhat the same way as Brooks Atkinson, and it closed rather quickly. 10 years later, a new production of Pal Joey was done, and at which point the times had changed. We had now come through World War II. We had now begun to have many changes and loosenings up from what we had in the 1930s. Remember, this Pal Joey, the original is 1940. So what we find now, Pal Joey is proclaimed to be a masterpiece. And this same Brooks Atkinson is still writing for the New York Times, and this time he recants. He says he is glad he is given the chance to denounce or to recant his earlier review, and that he now sees Pal Joey for the masterpiece that it is, and to see it for its integration, its strength of story, its characterizations, and the fitting of song and characters together. This brings us then to 1943, to Oklahoma. Now, at this point, Oklahoma is written by book and lyrics, in this case by Oscar Hammerstein II. Now, this is the same Oscar Hammerstein that we had. We go all the way back to 1927, the Oscar Hammerstein who wrote the book and lyrics for Showboat. So this is what we now have. We have Oscar Hammerstein. Oscar Hammerstein has gone on, has written a number of other works after Showboat. Most of them had not been successful. And so, in fact, he comes to the writing of this musical with a whole series of failures behind him. We bring together Oscar Hammerstein. We now bring together Richard Rodgers. Now, Richard Rodgers is the same Richard Rodgers who had been writing a whole series of extremely successful musicals with Lawrence Hart, who did indeed write, as I mentioned, On Your Toes and Pal Joey, and many other musicals in addition to that. At this particular time, Hart had become more and more difficult to write with, and when offered the chance to develop Oklahoma, Hart turned it down and said no, he was not interested. It was not a particular kind of musical. The story was not one that interested him. So Richard Rodgers then turned to another person that he had known for quite some time, but with whom he had never written, Oscar Hammerstein. So using the play by Lynn Riggs called Green Grow the Lilacs, these two people now began to turn it into a musical. Most people did not hold out any great hopes for success of this particular musical, and that is Richard Rodgers was writing with a new partner, and he had never written with anyone else but Lawrence Hart. Oscar Hammerstein had had a whole series of failures behind him. The producing organization, the Theater Guild, was not having a particular string of successes. And this particular musical did not sound like it was going to be something, a musical life on the Oklahoma territory right after the turn of the 20th century. This did not sound like what was going to be any kind of a successful musical. It opened then in 1943 with almost no hope of success, and overnight everything was changed. It was a great success. most of all, it became a celebration at a very point in time, a celebration of America. We are now in the midst of World War II. It reminded us again of the values that we held, of what made us Americans and what our American spirit was. In addition to this, it had, of course, the whole series of marvelous songs, many of which I've already talked about earlier. It also introduces and brings to the team which staging this particular musical, it brings a ballet choreographer, Agnes DeMille. Now, we've already mentioned earlier that Richard Rodgers had, of course, worked with ballet and worked with one of the great ballet masters of the period, George Balanchine, when he and Lorenz Hart had written On Your Toes, and the ballet Slaughter on 10th Avenue had been given. Now, however, they bring in Agnes DeMille, and Agnes DeMille decides that there is, or they tell her that there is a ballet which comes near the end of the first act. And they said, this is going to be a circus ballet. And Agnes listens to all of this and looks to see how these things are developing. And she says, no, this is not a circus ballet. What does a circus have to do with pioneer life on the Oklahoma frontier at the turn of the 20th century? This ballet is a ballet about Laurie, about the character Laurie, and it is her dream ballet. It brings to the stage here her fears of, yes, she is going to the box social with Judd Fry, but she is scared of Judd Fry. She would wish to go with Curly, but she is afraid that if she does, that Judd will in some way or the other attempt to harm Curly. So in the ballet, what we play out then is this dream in which Laurie goes to the box social with Judd. Curly tries to intervene, and Judd kills Curly. Remember, all this is a dream. But all this is also told through ballet. It now integrates totally the dance into the story itself. And this becomes then the last piece that needs to come together to make everything fit, because what we now have is a musical in which all of the elements are totally integrated. This becomes what is frequently known and what is called the strong book musical. By strong book meaning that everything, all the elements, song, music, dialogue, character, dance, and what other element we can come up with. All of these elements now combine to give us a unified whole. To develop the story, everything is there to move story, develop character. So all of this is now unified around book. It is exactly then this idea, and that is the unified, strong book, the development of character, song, music, dance, all of it fitting together, which for the next 20 years is the primary element or the primary form of the American musical. We can also see here that what we have begun to do also is there is a serious turn. And certainly by the time we get to the late 50s and we get to such things as West Side Story, which is the Romeo and Juliet story, moved to New York, 1950s, or Fiddler on the Roof from the early 1960s, which is a story of Jewish persecution in Russia under the Russian Tsar, and at the end, the emigration of the Jews from Russia, and eventually will come perhaps to America or many other countries. This is no longer comedy. This is now something else. This is now serious. And so what we find then is that we have begun to move away from the emphasis on comedy. We still have comics, we still have comedy within it, but it is not the totality of what it was in the earlier times. We now have serious subjects here. We have then the total bringing together of all of the elements, and for the next 20 years then, this is what we begin to, this is the primary form of the American musical. This is what we know of as the golden age of American musical. But what we also find is this still continues to celebrate the American life. Oklahoma, what? Celebration of the American frontier in Oklahoma just after the turn of the 20th century. The next musical that Rodgers and Hammerstein write, Carousel. Yes, taken from a Hungarian play, but what do? They transport it to New England. New England right at the later end of the 19th century, and develop then the American characters of Carousel. What is South Pacific? Yes, it takes place in the South Pacific. And yes, it is about World War II, but the leading characters are all what? The American soldiers, the American fighting force, and what happens to them in the South Pacific. So what we find here then is that we continue to celebrate America. One of the great musicals of the end of the 1950s, Meredith Willson's The Music Man, is very much then a celebration of American life in Iowa, just after the turn of the 20th century. And so we continue then to celebrate America, to use American popular music for the composers to move back and forth. But by the middle of the 1960s, this form of the American musical is in problems. It is in problems just as the American community, the American public is in problems. By the middle of the 1960s, we have begun to have the early stages of the Vietnam controversy. And so just as we are caught up in this unrest in this country, then also we find that we no longer are nearly willing to celebrate the American values that we find in the American music, and also that the sounds of the American music are now different from what they have been, and so therefore the American musical is now in trouble. And at this point, we will trace what happens in the American musical and its troubled state from the mid-1960s down to the present day.